Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. There are few scenarios in which either candidate can lose Florida and then win the White House. The polls put it neck and neck. Here today, we've got two people who can give us a great insight into where Florida is headed. They are Ryan Tyson, founder of the Tyson Group, that is one of Florida's leading polling companies. Hello, Ryan.
Hey, how are you, Nicholas?
Good. Whereabouts are you talking to us from, Ryan?
I'm in Tampa today.
Fantastic. And then we also have on the call David Rancourt, an independent political strategist and campaign advisor, formerly based in Tallahassee and a former member of the Florida Elections Commission. So, David, now where are you? You're somewhere a bit more different, I think, today.
Yes, I'm in Berlin, resuming my studies for my PhD. So I'm closer to you this time.
Excellent. Great to have you with us. And those of you who are on our 2016 election may remember that David was one of our experts, our expert in Florida. So it's great to have him with us. Just to start with, we're going to start with the real basics, Ryan. Why is Florida so crucial in a presidential race?
Well, if you look just at the basics, largest states in the union right now, California, number two. It used to be New York. Now it used to go California, Texas, New York, Florida. Now it's California, Texas, Florida, New York. And realistically, we're the only large swing state that's left. I mean, there are other swing states that are critically important, but none with 29 electoral votes. So the state is very large. The demographics of the state, as they've shifted over the last decade or more, make the state extremely competitive, and our margins of our elections very, very close. And the influx of people who move to this state every single year are what contribute to that. They're the main driver of that. Only about the last census we had in 2010 suggested that only about 13% of our growth in Florida comes from actually within the state. Most of the predominance, all of that, the rest comes from people who move in, essentially. So Florida is what it is. It will be the key state in this election, and it moves very, very close. A landslide here is about 2%.
Amazing stuff. Just to remind us, who has won and lost it? So think of the presidential candidates over the past 25, 30 years. Who's won it? Who's lost it? How's it played out?
Yeah, well, if you want to go back that far, the states pretty much goes with who the winner of the electoral college is, or who wins the election. Very few times has it ever been an outlier in that regard. I think what's more relevant, though, going back that far, the state was far more full of Dixiecrats, much wider than it is today. So those are not as instructive examples. If you get into this century, though, looking specifically from 2000 and to today, the last 20 years, the Democrats have lost all of those presidentials with the exception of Obama in 2008 and 2012. And the reason I think that's important, it goes to exactly how I feel like this election is playing out. President Obama was able to be the only Democrat to win this state at the top of the ticket because of the kind of voters that he appealed to and the kind of voters that he was able to turn out in record numbers. That's the only way that Joe Biden wins this state, is if he is able to turn out that exact electorate, that coalition of voters that many people call the ascending electorate, non-white, millennial, that sort of thing.
Let's come on to that. I don't want you to give the game away just yet, because I know you've been doing a lot of polling on it, and it's going to be really, really interesting.
Sure.
But before we come to that, just tell us about the makeup of the state. As you say, shifting all the time.
Sure.
I think we all know Florida is somewhere with a lot of retirees and a big Hispanic population. What can you say beyond that?
Yeah, well, I'd say the biggest piece of this was we were about 74% white in the 2004 election. That was when George W. Bush was reelected here in Florida. And we'll probably be about 64% white in this election. Most of that growth has come from Hispanics. They were predominantly Puerto Rican in that time frame. Then now it's especially non-Puerto Rican, non-Cuban. So these are people from Central and South America that are starting to come to this state. Specifically places like Broward County, South Miami-Dade, that sort of thing. So Florida's about. African-American population really hasn't grown at all as a share of the electorate in this state. Hispanic population has. There'll be about 16% of our election in this cycle. Hispanics will be 16, African-Americans will be probably 13. Democrats better hope they don't go lower than 13. And then the whites will make up about 64.
Okay, now
We
here
have
we get
very
in.
few. We have very few other racial minorities in this state that go much more beyond 1%.
Okay, okay. Well, now here we get into the nitty gritty. The national polls appear to suggest that it's a slam dunk for Biden. What's happening in Florida?
Well, I will say this: being a pollster in the era of Donald Trump is very difficult. The man, his name on a survey can, especially when it's in the election window, can really mess the survey sample up, the questionnaire up. And it's because there are voters who just flat out lie about their support for Donald Trump. And I know that there's probably a lot of smart, very educated, data-driven political scientists on this call that would laugh at that, but I have seen it in my own research. I've seen it in my own work. I've found it in my own qualitative settings when we're doing focus groups or whatnot. It is hard to get the right mix of the Trump voter because they enjoy lying on the phone. If I could be quite honest with you, the national polls do show the state is probably within 3 or 4%. My personal internal surveys show the president actually slightly up in Florida. I do believe that's where he is. I don't think that that Biden has hit the numbers that he needs to in the key segments of that demographic that he has to turn out. But that's just me.
Okay.
I think
that in a second we've got David Rancourt on the phone, and we're going to talk to David in a second about the difficulty of handling a contested election. What happens? So we're going to plug into some of David's experience on dealing with that. But let's bring up a map from 2016 that shows you how Florida voted last time. Ryan, can you just point to some of the sort of key areas down in the south? I think there's sort of Miami-Dade, Fort Lauderdale, the areas which we expect to be Democratic strongholds. Can you just sort of walk us through the state so we roughly know who's where?
Sure. So I think the first thing that's most obvious as you look at the colors is that Donald Trump does best where there are no people for the most part. So all of these dark red areas are very, very small populations in the state of Florida. I would say if you took all of the, I can tell you, I don't think I can draw with this, but if you envision essentially the blue county that's right there in the north, which is Alachua County, up to Jacksonville, which is up here in the northeast, and you go all the way across to I-10, which is the interstate that runs along the top. We're now calling this North Florida or the Panhandle.
Panhandle, yeah.
Yes, sir. They're making up no more than about 15% of the state's overall vote in that entire landmass. The predominance of the vote in Florida comes from two places. We'll start with the largest media market by votes cast, and that's the Tampa market. So essentially, Hillsborough County is the blue county on the Gulf Coast that you see here on the south end of I-4. But the market has got, I call them suburban counties. You've got Hernando, Sumter, you've got Pasco, Hernando, and Citrus to the north, which are pink to red counties. You've got Pinellas, that's to the west of Tampa, which is competitive. It went pink in 2016. It was a slight win for Donald Trump. Much more, it's very competitive this cycle.
That's up just underneath the Panhandle there in the curve of the Gulf of Mexico.
Yes, well, what I'm referring to, yes, sir. It's the county. Actually, no, it's at the south end of I-4. I'm referring to. You see where Tampa is? It's the blue county that's on the Gulf Coast. That is right in the middle of the peninsula. That's the one I'm referring to. That's Tampa. Pinellas is there, but underneath it is Manatee and Sarasota counties, which are also suburban counties. If you think about it, these little rural, they're not rural, but the suburban counties that I just pointed that are north and south of Tampa, the vote share that Donald Trump gets in those counties is sufficient to wipe out margins that Joe Biden will rack up in Hillsborough County. Does that make sense? That's why the market is more competitive than these actual counties, these urban centers. The same happens when you go, and Tampa is the largest market in the state. It's 24% of the vote. In Florida, which is interesting because people are used to Miami-Dade and Broward, which are the most populous markets in the state. They don't have more voters though than the Tampa market, which is interesting. That's important to understand why the state will perform the way that it does this cycle. I'll go to the second largest market in the state, which is Orlando, the Orlando market. If you look into Central Florida here, you'll see Orange County, which is the blue county here, and then Osceola, which is to the south of it. Those are the two blue counties that you see in the middle there of the peninsula. We're in the Orlando market. North of Orange County is Seminole, Volusia, Brevard. You've got the Villages, which is a Mecca retirement community, very, very big. People from all over the country come to retire there. This market goes all the way up to a place called Marion County, which is sort of that big red county there in the middle. And it goes all the way south to Osceola. And this market has the same dynamics. You see Democrats run up big scores in these blue counties, but when you go to all these outlying counties that surround those two counties, that's where you start to see Republicans in the suburbs bring their vote math back in line. So these two markets that are generically referred to in the press as I-4, the Tampa and the Orlando market will make up 44% of the vote in Florida, all of the counties that make up this bandwidth. And it's very competitive. The president won both markets in 2016. And typically the person who wins these markets can win the state. Now, here's what makes this election a little bit different. Let's go to Southeast Florida, and that's where this really starts to get different, this election cycle, because Miami-Dade is home to the most voters in the state of Florida. So they'll cast about 1,000,001 ballots just in Miami-Dade County alone. The reason why this county is critical, this election cycle, is because Donald Trump lost to Hillary Clinton in 2016 by 30 points. I mean, he just got absolutely steamrolled. So if you think about that, that's
in Miami-Dade
County,
yeah.
Correct. So if you think about that, that's just in the most populous, county in the state. That's a big deficit as you start, going north in the state. All the polling that I've done in Miami-Dade County suggests that the president has cut that margin in half and maybe even better. And the reason that is critical, and this is because of how he's done with Hispanic voters, the reason that's critical, and it's so hard to stress this, and you don't really see it in a survey sample because, again, Hispanics are 16% of the population. But when you come out of Miami-Dade County and the president has essentially ate into his deficit from 2016 by more than what he won the state by, understand that. He only won Florida by 112,000 votes in 2016. If it's true that he could cut his margin in half in Miami-Dade County, that's 150,000 votes that he brings out of that county that he didn't have in 2016. So for me, that's the county where election night starts, and it's where it ends, because if the Democrats don't get enough of their vote math there, it gets really tough to make those numbers up. Now, their strategy right now is they're kind of conceding that they have a problem with a lot of those voters down there, but they believe they're overperforming with white voters up on I-4, particularly the seniors. And that's what you're hearing about in a lot of the public opinion polls that are going around. I would offer that there's a lot of evidence that some of those voters are lying, but I know that in the academic sense, people would say I'm crazy for even suggesting that. But it's just very difficult for me to believe that a voter that's white and over the age of 65 that voted for Donald Trump in 2016, voted for Rick Scott in 2014, voted for Ron DeSantis in 2018, are all of a sudden now going to say, number one, that the state is better off now than it was 4 years ago, and that they personally are better off now than they are 4 years ago. But they're going to fire the president and go against all of those politicians I just named and split the ticket and vote for Joe Biden. I don't see that yet.
Okay. Now we've got a familiar face or familiar voice to some people on the line, and we're going to bring him in a second if he's okay with that in a moment. So that's Mike Bustamante, but we won't talk to him just a second. We'll go to David Rancourt, but we can bring Michael Bustamante. Michael Bustamante is our expert on Cuba. He lives in South Florida and is an academic who knows the Hispanic community very, very well. So we're going to come to Mike in just a second. Let's come to you, David Rancourt. It seems as though the issues don't matter in this election. We're just looking at those counties, and we've done this from state to state to state. It really does seem like, are you for or against Trump? And it seems as though the sort of conversations, the ordinary conversations about issues, I mean, Ryan talked about, are you better off? If you think about gun rights, there's so many other issues we could be talking about, but it seems to be a very sort of black and white election. Are you for or against Trump? Is that fair, David?
Very succinct. Well put, Nicholas. Yes. And I think it is a cult of personality on the Republican side. And I don't use the term cult in a negative way. Trump has a rabid following that I've never seen in Republican politics. Democrats tend to turn out people for rallies and protests. They're just better at it traditionally than Republicans. The rallies that Donald Trump has been able to pull off in the last 5 years are stunning by anybody's imagination. So it's a different world. It's a different landscape. And to many, it's about the Second Amendment. It's about the Bill of Rights. It's about religious persecution, if you will, certainly about the liberties to practice. And so these are sort of fundamental rights that Americans have argued and fought over for 200 and many years. They've all sort of come to a focal point in this election. And some people would argue it's a progressive view versus a conservative view, but it's a lot more than that. And as Ryan has pointed out, the predictability of this is really a challenge. And added to that, Ryan's spoken eloquently about the socially desired response in polling. There are many people, more particularly on the Republican side, that just aren't going to tell a pollster they're voting for Trump. If you post a tweet or a Facebook post supporting Trump in many circles, you become a social outcast. On the other hand, in many cases, people privately will say, hey, I love that. So a lot of people just aren't, as Ryan said, they're lying. And formally, that is, in an academic sense, a socially desired response, saying what you think people want you to hear. Again, to the unpredictability. Florida used to be a very easy state to, not to predict necessarily, but to understand demographically as far as partisan support. But in the early 90s and implemented in 1995, we passed what we call the motor voter bill, which allows people to register to vote in many, many convenient places without somebody pressing them or encouraging them to pick a party. So we've basically seen the growth of non-party affiliates in Florida become a third of the electorate, when historically it was a nominal percent. So it makes Ryan's job and other pollsters' job that much harder, because people are registered to vote without party affiliation. They don't vote in primaries, but they do show up in the general election, and you really don't know where they're going. So yeah, great analysis, good summation, Nicholas. And again, Ryan has probably more data points than anybody I know, so I'm excited to learn more from him.
Okay, we'll come back to you, Ryan, in just a second, and I'd love to follow up more about questions about the polling. I'm going to bring in Mike Bustamante just now, if we can. Mike, you'll just need to open your microphone up and just to talk specifically about the Cuban American population, but also Hispanics, who play an increasingly important role in Florida elections. How do you see things at the moment, Mike?
Thanks, Nicholas, and hi, everybody. It's good to be with you and join this conversation just for a brief minute. Miami-Dade County right now, as I was telling Nicholas just a short while ago, feels like we're in the McCarthy era 2.0, and I don't say that lightly either. The kind of rhetoric that's floating around, tagging Biden and the Democratic Party as equal to communist, equal to socialist, in some ways is, part and parcel of trends and discourses that we're seeing kind of in the campaign nationally, but it has a particular sort of valence or resonance in South Florida, where so much of the Hispanic population here traces their origins to countries like Cuba, like Venezuela. And even if they don't trace origins to those countries, they are predominantly right-leaning in their views of political developments back home, whether that's Colombia, Brazil, et cetera. So, the Cuban vote in particular is always fascinating, and full disclosure, as a Cuban American Democrat, it's always frustrating for me. I think I'm on safe ground in saying that the Cuban vote, or the Cuban community, is one of the only Latino communities in the country, if not the only, for whom support for Donald Trump has increased significantly since 2016.
And that's really important, because it's a big population. Also, it's a very politically influential population community there in South Florida, isn't it?
Yeah, there's two separate things I would say, right? The Hispanic population in Florida overall, and even in Miami-Dade County, is much less Cuban than it used to be in terms of just, percentages. So demographically, statewide, the quote unquote Cuban vote may not matter in some respects as much as it used to, but we all know that the Florida game is a margins game. So of course, the Cuban vote matters. Miami-Dade County matters, right? Miami-Dade County will go blue again, but as I was hearing some of the other panelists suggest, it's all about the margin of that. And all signs are suggesting that the Trump campaign has sort of, increased its support among Cubans in Miami-Dade County, and therefore that's going to affect the margins that the Democrats have in the county as a whole. But then in terms of like political influence, there's a separate question too about the way in which Cuban American Republicans are very integrated into the Florida political system and political leadership, which has been in Republican hands for a very, very long time. And I will say the one thing that the Trump camp, I think, has done well is that they have come to Miami-Dade County consistently, aggressively, since 2016, and they've made Cuban voters feel important with rhetoric that I think is, rather divorced from any kind of, legitimate policy analysis about what their measures are doing vis-a-vis things happening in Cuba or Venezuela, for example. But nonetheless, the Democrats have been playing catch up, and only recently have we seen them kind of try to do a full court press to sort of.
So you think the Democrats have really let it slip in South Florida?
I think that the Democratic Party's Hispanic outreach or Latino outreach, they haven't done well in that realm for a while. I mean, the Senate campaign of Bill Nelson in 2018 was a disaster in terms of Latino outreach, right? So I don't think that they've done well. There has been a big push to get Puerto Rican voters in the central part of the state. It's part of that. In some respects, the story of the Latino vote in Florida is kind of Puerto Ricans in the central corridor versus Cubans in Miami-Dade County. That's a simplification, granted. But I think Democrats are doing a real disservice to this margins game by not having a more consistent presence here in Miami-Dade County. And I say that with great respect and admiration for the Cuban American Democratic friends of mine who are here on the ground and trying to do good work. But they often haven't had the support from the national party in the way that I would have liked to see.
Yeah, and just before you go, Mike, the other really interesting thing you were saying, but I'm not too sure how politically significant it is in terms of this election. You were saying recent migrants from Cuba or Central America or wherever they're coming from tend to be more nationalist, tend to be more American nationalists, if you like, tend to be more inclined to support the president. Is that right?
Not quite. I mean, what I was saying pertains mostly to the Cuban vote in particular. Some colleagues of mine at Florida International University, where I work, have been polling Cuban American political attitudes and opinions for 20-something years now. And the general rule in the past was sort of the more recent a migrant you were, the closer you were to your own immigrant experience, the more likely you were to be sort of in the middle politically or open-minded, or even democratic leaning, right? And so for a long time, there's been this narrative that as sort of the older wave of Cuban Americans who came in the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Revolution, like my grandparents, as they disappear for biological reasons, the community is going to become more politically diverse. And what's happened over the course of the Trump administration is that we've seen a pretty strong swing back to Trump across sort of all cohorts of the community, particularly among the most recent migrants. And that is frankly a development that we're still trying to figure out and explain. How politically significant it is a different question, because the more recently arrived immigrant you are, unclear sort of what percentage of those folks have actually become citizens and therefore have the right to vote. But nonetheless, we've never seen a trend like that. And so the question is is this just a momentary thing that reflects the weirdness of this electoral cycle, or is this a more permanent shift? So that's something we'll be watching.
Mike, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We convinced Mike at the last minute to join us, but really, really good to have your insights. And I know you've got other things to be getting on with, so we'll fare you well. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Sure. Thanks, Nicholas. Take care.
Let's just recap here. It seems to me that Florida is still, the margins are still wafer thin. It is neck and neck. Ryan, can you just remind us of what your projection is and what, if you think, Florida has in common with the other swing states? Go ahead, Ryan.
You're asking for my projection on Florida, right?
Florida, but also what does it have in common with the other swing states?
Got it. Yes, sir. So I believe at this point that the president should hold this state. The margin should be somewhere between 0.5 point, as high as 1.8. I'm going to go that tight on the decimal. I think it's somewhere in there. And what Florida has in common with other states are going to be that a lot of the retiree electorate, a lot of the voters that are over the age of 75 in Florida, which, by the way, that makes up 13% of our vote in this state, many of them have retired from the Rust Belt states that you've discussed in your past classes. Arizona, I didn't mean to say that. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, even a lot of those Rust Belt states, so-called Rust Belt states from the north.
And I know you haven't been polling in those other states, but does that give you a sort of gut feeling about those states as well?
No, I have been polling in those other states, and I find the same. I find the exact same, very similar findings with the white voters up in those states as I see here. Probably the only outlier being Pennsylvania, because they have a lot of their rural whites west side of the state as compared to like everything around Philadelphia or whatnot. But I believe I would tell you the biggest similarity that I see are in who refuses to answer the ballot question on our surveys in Florida as well as in those other states. And let me explain to you what I mean by that, because there's a distinction. It's not, when you ask a ballot question on my surveys, I read the two major party candidates in rotation with a third party candidate that's on the ballot in that state. And if you say you're not sure, or if you say, I don't know, haven't made up my mind yet, that sort of thing, you're going to be coded as unsure. But if you say the words, I'm not answering that question, that's very different. That's a refusal. That's not a disconnect. They didn't hang the call up. They took the rest of the survey. They just didn't tell you their answer. That's what I see in every one of these states that's the same, including Arizona, is that the voter that refuses to answer the ballot question, and by the way, we're talking, this makes up 5 to 8, sometimes 9% of the sample. These voters are disproportionately white. They're disproportionately right of center in ideology. They're 3 of 3 voters, meaning that they have a high likelihood to turn out. And they all say that they're voting on election day, predominantly say they vote on election day. And they also disproportionately say that they're better off now than they were 4 years ago. Those are all the data points that I use that suggest to me that the polling top lines in all of those states, including Florida, are being dramatically misinterpreted. They've got to do a better job at looking at who's not answering the question.
Okay, and do you think most other polling companies are not taking that into account? I was reading a report in, I think it was the National Review, about the Trafalgar Group, and they were saying that, and a very similar thing to what you said.
He's right. Robert Kahali is right.
Okay, and can you just talk a bit more about Robert Kahali and what he was saying?
Sure. So Robert Kahali pioneered sort of the, David gave it the academic word, the socially desirable response patterning that we see in voters who don't want to say what they're going to do, because it may have a connotation that's bad for them. Kahali has pioneered a methodology of trying to get those voters more comfortable with you on the phone, and he doesn't like to reveal how he does it, but I do know that I see it in his methodology. When I see the shifts in those key demographics, I can tell you they're behaving in his surveys like their past political, their votes have been in the past, not necessarily what it looks like in a survey. So he's figured out, I think, how to penetrate through that. I've seen some of it as well in my research methodology. We'll ask a neighbor ballot and we'll rotate that in with a personal ballot. You can see in every single one of those metrics that the president overperforms Biden, especially with voters that are left of centers. I think that goes more to turnout, but I am a firm believer that this man is very difficult to survey. I think Robert's done a very good job of trying to account for that in his data. And his data in a lot of these other states like mine suggests that they're very, very tight margins. Florida's tight. It's, he's showing the president up 3. I had a survey last week that had the president up 2 in Florida. I don't know that he actually wins by 2 or 3, but he could very well come close. And I will say this too. You guys can look at this on election night if you're up this late, wherever you are in the world. If the president is winning Florida by more than 2 points, it's happened again. The voters that have moved to his column late are going to be the same ones that do it elsewhere. I really think you can watch Florida. If Florida's razor thin, then, and when I say razor thin, I'm talking 30,000, 50,000 votes, then I think you're going to start seeing evidence that white voters had actually underperformed the president from what they did in 2016, and then that would probably be an indicator of where the rest of those states are going. Fascinating.
Kahali is predicting that Trump wins by between 272 and 280, low 280s. So, I mean, those predictions are wafer thin. It's very, very, very hard to judge. But I think it's absolutely fascinating. You have answered the question that we were talking about yesterday: is how did the pollsters get it so wrong this time, and that Trump is so difficult?
Can I make a comment on that, on how they got it so wrong? In my opinion, when you look at any data set, ask yourself, what's the purpose of the data set that was collected, right? If you're holding on to a public opinion survey, was it the intent of the pollster to get his name out? Was it the intent of the pollster to get the brand of theirs out? Or was the intent to do thoughtful analysis? We try to do the thoughtful analysis piece, which is why you don't see most of our data public, because we gather data in a large scale, and then we look at the turnout model, and we try to ascertain how the turnout model of actual ballots being cast juxtaposed with the data that we see large scale. And that's where we see the difference. In other words, a ballot top line is 1/8 of the story. The leading indicators to me are what are inside the story. And that's why the public polls are so much different from those of us in the private sectors, because corporate America, which is who I predominantly work for, they want the facts. They don't want spin from the right or the left.
Okay. David, let's turn to you. And now the thorny issue of how the votes will be counted. There's a lot of concern about this. Huge pressures on the postal system. People are changing the way in which they vote. I know Florida's been making changes that enable people to vote earlier than they had been before. David, what's your experience? I mean, maybe should we look back to 2000, just briefly give an overview of what happened then and how Florida might be trying to avoid it this time, David?
Yes, you bring me back to my first days as the state election director in Florida in 1995, and I met a legend, a woman who had been a Florida supervisor for 30 years. Her name was Jane Carroll. She was supervisor of elections in Broward County, and when I first met her at a conference, she walked up to me and said, "You're the new director?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "You need to know one thing." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Hanging chads." And this was in 1995. And I thought, well, this woman's not very nice. And we later developed a great relationship. And I realized she was prophetic. She had known this for years. She knew these problems existed. And Florida was debating whether to adopt direct recording equipment. We call them DREs, where there is no paper trail. You push a button and a computer tabulates it. And if you're a software whiz, you might be able to figure out how it all works, but most supervisors elected aren't. So they rely on vendors who have source code that is a private record. So there are a lot of complexities to voting in Florida. There are a lot of complexities to voting everywhere in the world. And usually it doesn't matter because elections are won by 5 points, 6 points, 7 points. But when national elections come down to one county in one state and they're 30, 40 votes one way or the other, everything matters. And so how we tabulate votes, now we've gone back in Florida since the 2000 election, we upgraded to DREs. And then after some problems in the early 2000 elections, we banned DREs and went back to basically mark sensitive ballots, those bubble sheets where you pencil in a little circle. And they're effective. They're easy to tabulate. You can recheck them if you need to. There's a paper trail and people are happy with it. Florida.
Does every county in the state have to follow this? Is a statewide directive, or are individual counties responsible for the machinery? How does that work?
Great question. Yes, individual counties are responsible for the machinery, but there has been several federal funding sources that have helped augment those funds. So supervisors have the ability to have reasonably new equipment, but most of them have decent equipment. None of them have the best equipment. It's a budget issue. And the state doesn't do a great job of paying attention to these. Honestly, I had a bureau of 3 people in the voting system section in the late 90s when I was there. There's probably a dozen there now. They're better paid. They're more professional. They're more scientific in their degrees in history, but they're overworked and they have the process. So Florida is a very rigid. And I said in 2000, thank God it happened in Florida. As bad as it looked, we actually have certified voting systems. Everything is tested. We have pre-tests before elections. We have very thoughtful methodology in how things go into this. Now, whether or not supervisors adhere to all of these policies in every county, we can only hope, and I think in most cases they do, especially now because they know the scrutiny that they're under. And that's just what happens where people go to a poll on election day and get to vote. Now we also have early voting in Florida, which is extended as much as 2 weeks to 3 weeks, back down to 2 weeks, and we go back and forth over the argument of making voting so easy that it's unimportant, or making it such a sort of a ritualistic thing where it needs to be a priority and only be done on one day. The Republicans have largely lost the political battles on containing voting to one day. So we have early voting now that essentially lasts 3 weeks before an election, 2.5, depending on where you are. It's standardized throughout the state. Florida also has something called absentee ballots. The state of Washington, about 30 years ago, started a very progressive or aggressive, I should say, way to get voters to participate by something called mail ballot elections. Mail ballot elections are different from absentee ballots in that a mail ballot election is where a supervisor of elections chooses to mail every ballot, every voter in his database a ballot, and ask them to find it, to fill that ballot out, put it in a secrecy envelope, sign the outside envelope, and mail it in. It's a cumbersome process, but it can work. And back before the National Voter Registration Act, the motor voter bill that I referenced earlier, we used to be able to remove voters from the rolls for non-voting. So if you didn't participate in 2 elections, we removed you from the polls. if you showed up at the third election and were removed, you had the ability to vote, to make a ballot. It was held until it was confirmed that you were still eligible and then counted. And that still is the case, but we no longer legally can remove somebody for non-voting. So there is a multi-step process now that's required by supervisors to remove ballots.
You say that last bit like it's a good thing, getting people off the voter rolls. It doesn't.
Well, it is a good thing in that many people move in Florida. They move several times to different counties over a 4-year, 6-year period. So what you don't want is if you have a voting age population in a county, it's a good thing if you remove the right ones. Let me say that. So you don't remove them to be mean. You remove them because you want a clean voter file. So as people relocate and move, and as Ryan said, 13% of our voters are over 75, they expire. You don't want dead people getting ballots. You don't want dead people on the voter rolls, and you certainly don't want them voting. So that was the purpose of that. So the NVRA took actions and said, look, this is probably too aggressive, and maybe it was right. So we're going to force supervisors to mail, contact, reach out, and not remove a name just because they haven't voted in 2 elections. So it's harder to remove people now. My prediction in 1995, 96, when that happened, is we will very soon have voting age populations in counties of 500,000 people, and yet we will have 700,000 registered voters on the rolls, which is a physical impossibility. It just means your data set is filled with garbage, which isn't a terribly dangerous thing if you require somebody to show up and look you in the eye, show you an identification in order to vote.
Okay,
but if you mail ballots,
we've seen that in places like Pennsylvania, there expected to be a lot of debate over which mail-in votes are valid. Postal ballots, there's expected to be a lot of legal wrangling over the process, at least in Pennsylvania. With things being in Florida, is it going to be clearer because the electoral process has been organized that much better?
It is, and we will have litigation in Florida, undoubtedly. We always do, but it will be more things like suggested intimidation, people at the polls showing up doing things that they shouldn't. We don't have supervisors mailing unlimited numbers of ballots to people who don't request them in Florida, and I think that contains a lot of the confusion. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the very pillars of every democracy rest on the belief that the election is valid. And so if people don't have confidence in their election, they don't have confidence in their government, they don't have confidence in their country. So that's how important this is. The reality is, in a football sense, an American football sense, election supervisors are like offensive linemen. Nobody knows who they are. Nobody cares who they are. Nobody knows what they do until on national television, they fall down and that guy in the defense runs right through him and sacks the quarterback and the team loses the game. And then everybody in the world knows who that person is. So that's the life of an election official. Nobody knows you, nobody cares. But if you screw up, you're famous, and not in a good way. Yeah, so those are the challenges. But we don't have, we have absentee ballots in Florida. We have early voting. I don't anticipate any major issues with how any of that's done. It's well established. We do it a lot. What we will have is a very close election. And we will have a system, and ultimately, there's a playbook for that. It's actually fairly predictable. It ends up in the federal courts almost immediately. The Democrats will shop judges. The Republicans will shop judges. They'll file a case in a circuit where they think they can win. Ultimately, any election case in this election is going to end up at the U.S. Supreme Court. And, that's why I think, you see what's going on in Washington for getting the approval of this justice. It's no secret that there's only 8 now. Right. So we'll see how that goes.
Okay. If you're wondering where those American football analogies come from, it's because David played and he still looks like he plays. Let's bring in some questions now. And we've been talking about the process. We've been talking about polling. We've been talking about people going to the polls. We haven't really spoken much about the issues. So if you want to bring those up, David has taken me. We've met members of the RA. We've also the NRA in Florida. Karen and I have been to a shooting gallery. What would you say? Is it a shooting gallery? Shooting range. There we go. Care of David. So gun rights might be an issue you might want to talk about. David's got very strong views about that. So do bring those questions in. Let's start with some questions at the top. Okay, Claudia Baker. Let's start with you, Claudia. Do you want to open your microphone? There you go, Claudia.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, can hear you. Go
Yes,
ahead.
I think you covered it to some extent. It's about the Cuban minority in the south of Florida. How are they being affected specifically by the foreign policies of Biden and Trump?
Ryan, do you think the US policy towards Cuba has played a role in this election? Are people aware of it? Are they thinking about it?
I got to tell you, my sense, I would defer to Bustamante on this, but my sense is not as much. There is a cohesive, passionate base of the Cuban community that either is one generation removed from the island. Those are pretty, or they were on the island and they're aging now. That's that group that didn't like the rhetoric from Donald Trump in 2016, and all of that has went away by the actions of his administration over the last 4 years. They see them all as supportive. I personally don't believe that I can point to any policy nuance as it relates to Cuba that I could point to. Now, he did bring I think he put the embargo back in, I think. I get confused, but yeah. I don't think that's something that those voters are already with him, is what I'm trying to trying to say. They didn't, those oldest hardliners were with him in 2016. He's been able to expand that. And I honestly think it's not, Claudia, it's not because of anything Trump has done. He's doing better with these Cubans because of the Democrat Party. They've driven these voters to Trump. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yes.
It doesn't make sense to me. So how do you think they've driven them? I can see on the policy side how the Trump administration completely reversed the rapprochement that Obama introduced. The US opened an embassy, they opened up trade, Trump rolled all of that back. So you could understand as a Cuban American, if you're a right-wing Cuban American, you think Trump has done the right thing. So I get it in terms of policy terms, but they were already on the Republican side anyway. So how have the Democrats driven votes over to them?
I would say it's candidate selection, starting back in 2018, Andrew Gillum, his rhetoric, how he campaigned. Let me be very clear what I'm trying to say. The far left, and you see many caricatures of the far left at the national level, the policies that are being, I don't know if you're familiar with the squad. These are the liberal female members of Congress. It's those sort of caricatures that scare the ever living daylights out of certain segments of the Hispanic community, not just Cuban, but certain segments of the Hispanic community in Florida, because they honestly don't understand the rhetoric that says, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, there would be comments from Democrat officials publicly, and they would say this country is a shithole, that sort of thing, or the kind of things that we're dealing with. These are horrible. These voters that are once removed from places that really are shitholes they don't connect on that narrative. They don't see how the country that's giving them this opportunity is this evil place that they're being told from the top of that ticket. So I would say that it's the social justice actions, it's the identity politics. Those are the things that the Hispanic voters that I'm seeing down here that are now in play for Donald Trump. That's the stuff that moved them to Trump. It was nothing that Trump did himself. He's become the lesser of two evils in too many of their minds.
Yeah, so it's the sort of Bernie Sanders side of the party, Cortez.
Yes.
The much more.
But it's not. But I will also say this though, and we're all adults here, so we have to be able to talk about politics and how race politics intersect. The Black Lives Matter movement probably has done more to solidify this than I believe anything else, in my opinion. The rioting that you saw in the wake of Black Lives Matter, these are
solidifying the perception that the Democrats are leftists bent on destroying the state.
Yes, if you talk to Cubans on the ground, and if you talk to new Hispanics that are non-Cuban, non-Puerto Rican, there is a great disconnect on that. Frankly, the questions being asked in certain communities in Miami-Dade County is, well, do our lives matter? I mean, I would offer this to you. When this election's over with, you think about this in the back of your head. Is it possible that you're going to say, wow, the Democrats did an all-in on a minority base of their party that hasn't grown as the share of the electorate in decades? And it costs them just enough of the only demographic that is growing in Florida and in most of the country. It's a question. It's a hypothesis. I don't really know the answer 100%. I know it's not the case with Mexicans for the most part, that are predominantly the Democrat Latinos from the West Coast and the Mountain region.
Isn't it? It's basically you're saying that they've lost the Hispanic vote in Florida, but elsewhere you'd expect them to be leaning Democrat. Yeah.
Correct. He's improved his margins in those other places, but with the ones we have in Florida, I think he can win the Hispanic vote in Florida this time.
Okay. Right, Piers Reynolds. Let's bring Piers up. So this is developing. We've talked about this already. He's talked about polling, but Piers, go ahead.
Well, 2 points about it. First of all, I'm talking about the shy voters who don't want to reveal their allegiance to the pollsters. First of all, is that more or less than 2016? And if it's more, why? And secondly, could there not be another interpretation of it? I'm thinking of perhaps there are Trump supporters, perhaps in the older generation who are living in predominantly red areas. Maybe they're shy about revealing a switch in allegiance, which seems to be happening nationally among the older age group.
Piers, I mean, I think you're right in a way. I mean, Ryan, we've got a home in on this one. Trump has, he's had a very controversial time. He's got to retain his white blue collar base, despite some events that have been appalling in COVID, and it's hard to see how he can retain it. So just in terms of perception, it's hard to see how the people you are polling are all going to be saying, I'm voting Trump exactly the same as last time.
Well, Pierce brings up it's plausible. It could be that way. I guess we won't know until we start counting ballots. But I say I have a hard time just seeing how that happens. I don't understand why. In America today, if you think about it in popular culture, if you are a Biden supporter, you are considered. I mean, you walk upright, right? If you're a Trump supporter, you're a mouth breather, you're a racist, you're a misogynist, you are all of these things. There's no social pressure against Biden people that I can see in these red areas that you're talking about, other than the fact that they're one in a sea of many on the opposite side. But I don't know that social pressure is as bad the other way as you describe it, Pierce. At least in my opinion, I don't think it's as bad.
First of all, two things. Is it more evident now than it was in 2016?
I think we know how to read it now. I would argue that, like you asked the question about levels compared to 2016. I didn't know what I was looking at in 16 until I went back afterward and dove into those crosstabs. I think that what happened was two different things occurred. There was very high unfavorabilities for Joe Biden for Hillary Clinton as the campaign ended, and as we got towards election day, take the state of Florida for example. Hillary Clinton was up by 3.5% of the 6.2 million ballots that had been cast. Florida got to 9.6 million total votes, so that roughly was whatever the math is, million additional votes cast on election day. Donald Trump won that segment by 12.5%, dominated election day because of how the campaign closed. I would offer to you that's still the biggest thing that matters in this. I think Donald Trump wins this entire election, depending on how the next 7 to 10 days go. Meaning, and I would point to Joe Biden's image on this point. Joe Biden has failed to see the intensity of his positives surpass the president's. I want you to think about that. What does that mean? What does that mean? Why would Joe Biden fail to have in any of our samples the same intensity of his positives as the president? He's about 7 to 8 points behind the president on the intensity of his positives, and the president's negatives, the intensity of the president's negatives are obviously higher than Biden's. But I'm saying as we close this campaign, I'm asking you to take your head and think about it for a second. Yes, I think there's hidden Trump voters, and Pierce, you make a good point. There could very well be hidden Biden voters. But I think as you go to the end of this campaign, you have to ask yourself, has Joe Biden connected with the key segments of the electorate in America that Democrats need to win? Has he? Is he the one that will bring that vote math back for them? Or is it a different school of thought? Is it that Joe Biden has completely changed the Democrat vote math, that all of a sudden now the Democrats celebrate old white voters? I don't think it's the latter. I don't think it's the latter. No. I think that they've done a good job of getting their message to older white voters, but I don't see that it's largely different than where we found ourselves 4 years ago. I still believe that the key question of this campaign is, does Biden have the ability to turn out the ascending electorate just as Obama did? I don't think the answer is yes.
Well, I don't know about Obama, but I think he has the ability to turn it out stronger than Clinton did. But that's a different point. Let me come back to this thing of the people who are.
Liz, can we come back to it in a second? Do you mind? Because we've got a queue of people lining up for questions. I want to get them in. So if we've got time to come back to you, I will. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's bring up Hilary Matthews. And Hilary, I think we've covered part of this, but go ahead, Hilary. You just need to unplug your microphone if you look at the bottom left of your screen.
I'm reading her question right here.
Hi. You have really answered my question, but I find it extraordinary. I don't know how many of the Hispanics you've been talking about are recent immigrants, but given Trump's rhetoric about building the wall and his anti-immigration and the whole thing about children being separated from their parents, I find it very difficult to understand why that demographic would vote for him if maybe they're still illegal immigrants and they can't vote. But he was in his 2016 campaign, it was all about building the wall and that the Mexicans were going to pay for it, and none of that has happened. And my second very quick question is, the Rust Belt manufacturing industry has not improved over the last 4 years, as I understand it. So I'm wondering why those grey-haired voters who've moved down to Florida still are going to vote for President Trump.
So that last point is a very interesting one, Ryan, and maybe David too. People were angry with the government for the failure to deliver. So it was a vote against the administration. Again, couldn't people vote against the administration for the failure to deliver?
I'm sorry, I'm getting asked about immigrants. I'm being asked
you
about
got two
manufacturing.
things
Which
there.
one do you
One
want
is about
first?
manufacturing, so that's manufacturing the Rust Belt. So this is sort of goes outside of Florida, but I guess
Okay.
those populations were influenced by their heritage from other states. And then there's a separate question about.
Well, so the economy. So let's say this. So I just finished a survey in Michigan. I think we could all agree Michigan, domestic auto manufacturers, that sort of thing. I asked the question of voters in my sample that I just finished there not 10 days ago, which was really at the bottom of the president's peak. The president had a really rough 12, 15 days here leading up to that first debate. And then when he got his COVID diagnosis and all, I was getting 56% of voters in Michigan in my sample that said they're better off today than they were 4 years ago. Now I'm seeing some questions in here as it relates to how can that be? I mean, Hillary asked the question, manufacturing hasn't been reinvigorated. How can that be? I don't know. You'd have to ask them. I don't live in Michigan. But if a voter tells me that they're better off now than they were 4 years ago, not trying to be arrogant, I'm going to take their word for it. And if I can get on the field and do qualitative research with them and focus group them, I'd have a better answer. But we are not able to do qualitative like we used to in the era of COVID. But I'm going to take their word for that. And I would also offer that, again, I want you all to take for a second and think about this. Everybody, I feel like in the world and in the national and in the global press looks at President Trump's antics and how outlandish they are and how he acts foolish in many ways. But for many in America, they think the left is just as bad, if not worse. So I feel like a lot of times people lose that for many Americans, this is the choice of a lesser of two evils, which is sad. It's unfortunate. But I think that's the difference, is do they really think that Joe Biden in and of himself is the one to address the concerns that they have? And I think that's where you see the last 10 days of this campaign.
I mean, Ryan, it may purely be that it's not about Biden at all. It's about anyone but Trump.
I think that I would offer this interpretation of that. Anybody who was anybody but Trump was probably all Clinton last time. I don't know that there's evidence that there's a distinction between the two. I would argue to you, because this election is...
the distinction is that he's been in office for 4 years and you've got something to assess him on.
And I would offer to you, if voters feel like they're doing better off now than they were 4 years ago, I mean, are we calling them liars? I mean, are they not better off in your interpretation of what they think that they should feel better off on?
How you create your poll. That's the big question, isn't it? So we don't know.
It's pretty simple to do a simple random sample and execute a short questionnaire. We don't try to get into the divining of, well, what should this look like or whatnot. We make sure that our geographic targets, our demographics are sound as they should be, as shown in past elections. We pull a simple random sample from the voter file and we ask for a specific individual, and if they're not there, we go move on to the next person. Anyhow, so I think I see a couple more questions on here.
Let's bring up Fran Hoffman. Hillary, we did spend some time with Mike Bustamante talking about the Hispanic issue, so I'm going to move on from that one. So Fran Hoffman, Fran, go ahead.
Yeah, wow, there's a lot in here, and I wanted to just uplift Pierce's original observation that it's plausible that voters who are refusing to answer are doing out of a sense of who their peer group is. So a Trump voter may be more sensitive to his or her family members, neighborhood, community affiliations than he is to national polls. And so it would be more embarrassing to say that he or she was shifting to
yeah, it could go
Biden
both ways. But what was your question? Your question was about COVID.
So yes, okay. So my question was COVID. We haven't talked about that. That seems to lead the nation in terms of its salience to voters. There are very few Americans who
so far, have we?
COVID has become hyper politicized in the United States. Starting as early as in April, you could see it very clearly down ideological lines. I would offer this, and nobody wants to admit this in the survey data because it makes us feel embarrassed, right? But Donald Trump is doing measurably better with voters under the age of 50, specifically 45. And I think the only plausible reason for that is because you have parents who want their kids back in school, and you have younger generation that had jobs. They've been doing well for the last 4 to 8 years, and then it all came to an abrupt halt. And I think that you're seeing some politics that are unconventional for the national global narrative, where you have a lot of Americans who want to get back to work. They want to provide for their families. They want to see their kids in school. They'd like to see it done safely. But increasingly, you're seeing a lot of folks in Florida who are asking themselves, were all the precautions that we took, putting all of these people out of work and putting our country into the debt that we did, was that the best decision? They're asking that. And I can't think of any other reason why people under the age of 45 would all of a sudden have tighter margins to the Republican ticket without any other explanation. I can't think of any other one. But that's how I find that fascinating, that I see that. So yes, I think that voters who are concerned about COVID, and they cite that as their number one issue to vote, I would suggest that there's a strong correlation on their ideological and their partisan ballot performance, both today and in the past. Voters who are mostly concerned about COVID, in other words, are voting Democrat. Voters who are most concerned about the economy and recovery, they're voting Republican.
Okay, we've got just a few more minutes left. David, do you want to add to that? And then I'll bring Caroline Sunnell. Go ahead, David.
Yes, very quickly, and I think Ryan handled it beautifully. Is it the chicken or the egg, which comes first? I think probably your beliefs and how COVID was handled is more determined by your ideology than anything else. And it is not a massive driver in this election, despite I think the media trying to make it one. And again, just lastly, I think Ryan handled this well as well. But back to the point on the socially desirable response, I can't emphasize enough what Ryan said. There is almost zero social pressure on anyone in this country to not support Joe Biden. It is perfectly acceptable in every community that I've ever seen and been in. And I live, frankly, with a bunch of rich white people who would never give somebody a hard time for supporting Biden. They just don't. The intensity of the criticism of people who support Trump. I mean, I wouldn't put a bumper sticker on my car in this election if my life depended on it. It's just
same with yard sign, David. Same with yard sign.
Yes, exactly. It's just a recipe for disaster. And I think the stark difference between the 2020 election and the 2016 election is the left never contemplated for a moment that Donald Trump could actually win. So they weren't nearly as critical of the Trump voters. They just would pat them on the head and say, "You stupid fool, keep dragging your knuckles and drive on. He doesn't have a chance. We're going to win." And then lo and behold, the guy won. So now the left firmly believes, and I'm not in either camp, by the way, the left firmly believes that Trump actually can win this thing. So therefore the criticism, the intensity is that much more. And it simply just doesn't go as hard the other way, right, wrong, or indifferent. I just personally haven't seen it, never seen it in data. And I'm in neither camp. I'm a libertarian, so nobody likes me. So forgive me if you don't like my answer, but it's my answer.
Okay. Nicholas, can I give you one more thought on that note, or do you? Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
would just give an anecdotal story real quick to prove what David is saying. Okay. 2018, my wife puts a picture on Facebook of our youngest son, and he wanted to vote. So he put on there who he voted for. It was our mayor in Tallahassee, and then he voted for Ron DeSantis. That's who he wanted to vote for. And my wife got a Facebook message from one of her friends in California. She's a white liberal. She's a lead. And she
Ron
says,
DeSantis being the Republican governor.
Republican governor, correct. But I want you to listen to this very carefully. This proves David's point. The friend says, oh my gosh, I was worried you were a racist, and now I know you are. And my wife's like, what the heck? See, that's that race politics from the white liberal elites that has really fired up a lot of folks on the right. Fast forward to this year, that same girl sends a mystery package to my wife, and the book says, dealing with white supremacy in me was what it said. So I would offer to you, we're going to be able to narrow this down, but it's the way that white liberal elites just grind on Trump voters and on voters on the right. But most importantly, never forget this, folks. Only about 35% of this country likes Donald Trump. That's it. The balance of his vote thinks that white liberal elites are crazy, and they just vote for Donald Trump because they don't feel they have another alternative. I really think that's what this election is. Never think that this is about liking Donald Trump for Florida voters or American voters. It's not. He doesn't have enough of them. It's the ones who think that he's the lesser of two evils. And I think that's where post-mortem on this campaign, it'll be fascinating to dive down into those metrics.
Okay, last two questions coming in. Caroline Sumnall, this is a question about the economy. And Caroline, it might be about people's 401ks as well.
Yeah.
So,
I would agree with that. I'm reading her question. I can tell you real quick. She says, when people in Florida say they're better off than 4 years ago, what are they referring to? I think it's completely that. And I also think it was a very hot economy that got stopped. We've never before in the history of the US economy, the world economy, ever had a self-imposed coma, but that's what we did. And I think that's why you have a lot of people asking the politics of COVID. There aren't dead people in the streets like we were told that was going to be. Hospitals never got full overrun. I know they did in a lot of places, but not in Florida. So that's why you have a lot of voters asking, did we do the right thing? And then the next question I see here.
Diane, let's just bring in Diane and she can ask that question. Go on, explain your question, Diane. It's not exactly clear from what you've written here. I think I know what you mean, but go ahead, Diane.
Yeah, I was just picking out a few things that I heard you say, Ryan, which is slightly different from the way the conversation's been going. But you did talk at one point about social justice. I'm not quite sure that was how you expressed it. But and then you talked about how Trump is doing well with the under 45s. And I guess what I'm really interested in is, do you see that in America people want change, not necessarily of the left or the right, but just something different in their politics, and it plays itself out, obviously, between Biden and Trump?
I can't answer that question with certainty right now. I feel like as this election closes, if the president's antics just get too much for certain people, then I think that segment who just wants less drama are going to absolutely break Biden's way. I really think that. But I don't know how to quantify how many people who want a change. I asked when you think about, first of all, how many incumbent presidents have been defeated in American history, it's hard to do, very hard to do. We can only talk back to George H.W. Bush, who's now passed, who was defeated by Bill Clinton. Okay, so it's number one. Let's start with the premise. No, George H.W. Bush was defeated by Bill Clinton.
Yeah. I think it was Jimmy Carter as well being defeated as a.
Oh, I wasn't even going back that far. I wasn't alive when that happened, so that's why I'm not bringing it up. But it doesn't happen. We've now given the two instances, and what is this, 60 years where that's occurred? So it's hard to defeat an incumbent president. I asked this question, Diane, if over half of survey samples just feel like they're better off today than they were, it's hard to fire the president when that's the way that it is. The question is will there be an unprecedented movement where they actually do like where they're at, but they're going to still fire the president? That would be very much out of the norms. And I would offer to you, it's quite possible it could happen. It absolutely could happen. But as it relates to the social justice is what I was referring to. The way that the Black Lives Matter movement played out is what I was referring to. The way that the Black Lives Matter movement played out in America, it offended many segments of the middle and the right. but they're not allowed to say, like David was saying, you're not allowed to talk about that. You're not allowed to have an opinion other than what's prevailing, and you're definitely not allowed to ask a question. The idea is you keep your mouth shut and you do what you're told, as the masses, as the mobs, as the groupthink tells you to. That's a dangerous combination, in my opinion, for the American public.
Okay. I think it's fair to say, you two both don't mind me saying, you've both worked as advisors for Republicans, and I know David's worked for the other side as well. So that gives you, I think it's great for us. We're getting different perspectives here all the time, each session we do. I've really, really enjoyed this one. I think that Ryan's got to move on. He's got a busy day. I don't know if David is getting back to his studies, but if either of you are able to stay on and join our discussion after the program, which is where we all share our views, please do stay on the line. But if not, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's been a really, really good discussion, and I think we feel much more enlightened. But who knows which way Florida is going to go.
Thank you. And Nicholas, thank you for what you do. And if I may, thank my friend Ryan for doing this. He is the preeminent pollster in the state of Florida on a national level, as good as they get. And if anybody's numbers are right, he's the only guy I trust, if that matters. So Ryan, thank you. And Nicholas, thank you for doing political tours. You inspire me every year. You're a big reason why I'm back in school. So I think most times I thank you. So keep doing what you're doing.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Thank you very much indeed, David. Thank you again, Ryan. Okay.